It wasn't just a sequel. It was a resurrection wrapped in frustration, an exorcism, not of demons, but of creative control. The Exorcist III wasn't born to follow in the footsteps of spinning heads and levitating beds. It was meant to be something else entirely. A cold, intellectual descent into metaphysical horror, penned and directed by William Peter Blatty, the original author of The Exorcist. For him, this wasn't just another movie, it was a reclamation of his vision, his theology, and his pain. But Hollywood had its own rituals. The studio demanded a title it could sell, a climax it could market, and a familiar face it could plaster on posters. What Blatty delivered was Legion. What they forced into theaters was The Exorcist III. Somewhere between those two lies, the film that has haunted audiences ever since. This is not a story about demonic possession, it's about spiritual sabotage, about the battle between faith and commerce, about scenes that vanished, voices that weren't heard, and performances that were buried. So forget what you think you know. This isn't just another horror sequel, it's a cinematic confession booth. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Exorcist III. Fact Hasson. It was born as Legion and then possessed. Before it was The Exorcist III, it was something entirely different. Legion. William Peter Blatty, the original mind behind The Exorcist, didn't write a sequel. He wrote A Reckoning, a slow, philosophical horror story that probed guilt, identity, and the nature of evil itself. No spinning heads, no exorcisms, just quiet dread and whispered damnation. The studio wasn't pleased. They wanted a product that screamed familiarity. So they changed the title, rewrote the climax, and insisted the film connect to the first movie. Blatty resisted. He lost. Not only did they force him to add a climactic exorcism that never belonged, they recast key roles and rearranged the structure to better suit a marketing campaign. The final result was a film split between two souls: Legion, the story Blatty fought for, and The Exorcist III, the film they released. When a story is renamed and reshaped against its creator's will, can it still tell the truth? Fact #2. Brad Dourif's Gemini killer performance was hidden in plain sight. Brad Dourif delivered one of the most chilling monologues in horror history, and barely anyone saw it. Why? Because it was buried. Originally, Dourif played the Gemini killer in full, every word, every scene. His voice was cold, hypnotic, his eyes never blinked. There were no effects, no gore, just a man calmly describing unspeakable acts. The horror came from how still he was. But when the studio forced Blatty to bring back Jason Miller as Father Karras, they rewrote the scenes so both actors shared the same role. The Gemini killer would now shift faces, cutting between Miller and Dourif mid-sentence. The result was jarring, inconsistent, and deeply confusing for audiences. It wasn't until decades later, with the 2016 director's cut, that we saw the unbroken version of Dourif's performance. And when we did, it became clear. This wasn't just a good role, it was an exorcism of human reason. What's more terrifying than evil? Evil that never raises its voice. Fact #3. The corridor scene didn't need blood to break you. A quiet hospital. A nurse walks across the screen. Silence. She walks again. A door opens. Then suddenly, a figure in white rushes out. Surgical shears raised, the frame erupting into a single, blaring sound. It's over in seconds, but it lingers for years. This scene, often cited as one of the greatest jump scares ever filmed, is terrifying not because of gore or monsters, but because it respects patience. It lulls you into a false sense of nothingness. It makes your brain go soft, and then it strikes. Blatty and his team shot it 8 times to get the timing perfect. The camera's slow pan, the rhythm of footsteps, the sound cue placed just milliseconds before the reveal. It's cinematic architecture at its most manipulative and most effective. Even directors today reference this moment. It broke the rules. It made silence scary again. Is it still a jump scare when the terror was waiting there all along? Fact #4. The Zodiac Killer wore a new name: Gemini. The Gemini Killer is fictional, but his DNA? Unmistakably real. William Peter Blatty modeled the character after the infamous Zodiac Killer, a still unidentified murderer who terrorized California in the late 1960 seconds. Both killers chose victims with symbolic intent. Both communicated cryptically with authorities, and both seemed more interested in the ritual than the result. But where Zodiac used symbols and codes, Gemini used theological mockery, turning sacraments into executions. Blatty wanted to explore evil not as chaos, but as intelligence without empathy. The Gemini killer isn't a monster. He's a philosopher of death. And when Brad Dourif embodied him, he didn't raise his voice. He dissected it all, clinically. A man describing damnation like a surgeon, explains a tumor. Maybe that's what makes it worse. Evil, when it's calm, feels closer to real. Fact #5. George C. Scott brought more than acting, he brought fury. You don't direct George C. Scott, you contain him. On set, Scott refused multiple takes. He believed true emotion could only be captured once, so when the camera rolled, what you saw was often real rage, not scripted. Blatty let him go. In one intense scene, Scott smashed a chair so hard that glass shattered behind him. The crew froze. No one yelled cut, and that take stayed in the final film. Scott didn't just play Lieutenant Kinderman, he was a man unmoored by grief, faith, and horror. His raw energy gave the film a kind of unpredictable gravity. You weren't watching a performance. You were watching a breakdown with a badge. Was he acting? Or exercising something of his own? Fact #6. The studio didn't want theology, they wanted fire. Blatty's original cut of the film had no exorcism, no flames, no Father Karras. The climax was internal, a battle of words, of belief, of psychological surrender. The studio rejected it. To them, The Exorcist meant visual spectacle, so they demanded a full exorcism scene be added complete with Jason Miller's return, fire effects, and a chaotic, supernatural finale. Blatty protested. He lost. Miller was unwell. He could barely memorize lines. His footage had to be pieced together. The added climax felt grafted on, and it was. Decades later, the director's cut removed the entire sequence. No demons, just consequence. Which ending scares more, the one with fire, or the one that burns slower? Fact #7. Death walked onto the set and didn't leave quietly. The Gemini Killer talks about death with surgical calm. And one night, while that dialogue echoed through the set, death actually showed up. During a late-night shoot at the hospital location, a crew member, specifically the carpenter foreman, collapsed and died of sudden cardiac arrest. The scene being filmed? One of Brad Dourif's longest, most unnerving monologues about souls in limbo. The moment passed quietly, but its shadow remained. Electrical failures began happening daily. Lights blew out. A dolly track derailed. One assistant camera operator walked off and never returned. Not because of superstition, because he said something felt wrong. Blatty never commented directly. But he canceled all night shoots the following week. Maybe it was just coincidence. Or maybe the film wasn't the only thing being watched. Fact #8. You didn't just hear the horror, you felt it. Sound in The Exorcist III wasn't just background, it was psychological sabotage. Blatty and sound designer Dino DeMuro used infrasound subsonic frequencies that bypass conscious hearing and go straight to the nervous system. Viewers reported nausea, anxiety, and chills without knowing why. Some scenes embedded reversed Latin chants beneath dialogue. Others looped heartbeats, breathing, or animal bone scraping slowed to an unnatural rhythm. One effect involved blending Brad Dourif's voice with whisper tracks at barely audible levels, creating a sense of dual presence. The goal wasn't to scare you through noise, but to trick your body into believing something invisible was close. What's more, terrifying what you hear, or what you can't explain hearing. Fact #9. The British censors drew the line at a single sentence. Violence, fine. Exorcism, sure. Screaming demons, approved. But one line, a calm, clinical description of a child's mutilation, was too much for the British Board of Film Classification. Spoken without music, without emphasis, The Gemini Killer describes placing severed fingers into a victim's mouth. There's no blood on screen, no flashbacks, just words. And that was the problem. Censors demanded the line be removed for UK theatrical release. Not because it showed too much, but because it forced the audience to imagine too vividly. When the VHS came out later, the line was restored. The image never existed, but your mind created it anyway, and that was exactly the point. Fact #0. The dream sequence was pulled from a fevered mind. In the opening act, there's a scene that feels entirely out of place, yet utterly unforgettable. A glowing train station filled with statues, angels, severed heads playing poker, and silent screaming. A dream of the afterlife, or maybe something else. Blatty didn't invent it, he saw it. During a prolonged fever in the 1,980 seconds, he experienced a vivid waking dream. He later described it as a place between thought and guilt, populated by familiar faces speaking in riddles, their mouths sewn shut, floating in white light that never cast shadows. He wrote it down the next morning, word for word. The studio hated it, said it slowed the pacing. Blatty insisted. He called it the soul of the film. Even Samuel L. Jackson appears in that sequence, in a blink and you'll miss it cameo as a man with no mouth, delivering one line dubbed by someone else. Was it surrealist horror or a message from the space between life and death? Fact Hasanone, a death scene based on religious torture. Father Canavan's murder isn't shown in full, but its aftermath is deeply unsettling. His neck twisted, lips sewn shut, left inside the confessional booth like a discarded sacrament. This wasn't a horror movie invention. Blatty drew inspiration from actual medieval punishments used on priests accused of heresy. One 14th century woodcut depicted a cleric with his mouth sewn closed to prevent him from speaking further blasphemy. Another showed torsion as a form of divine judgment, twisting the head to face backward as a metaphor for spiritual blindness. Blatty's idea wasn't to shock, it was to ritualize horror. Evil in The Exorcist III punishes its victims with meaning, not randomness. Even the set for the confessional was reconstructed from a 15th century cathedral blueprint, complete with a hidden Latin inscription above the arch, unseen by the camera. When a killing becomes liturgy, what exactly is being worshipped? Fact Hasono. Jason Miller returned, but he wasn't the same. The studio wanted Jason Miller back. His face was iconic. His name sold the idea that The Exorcist III was a true sequel. But in reality, Miller was in decline, struggling with memory loss, health issues, and alcohol-related damage. His performance had to be broken into short takes. Cue cards were hidden off-camera. Sometimes his voice was dubbed, his gaze unfocused, his energy distant. And yet, somehow, it worked. The character of Father Karras isn't alive. He's trapped, fractured, lost. And so was Miller. His performance became unintentional method, acting less resurrection, more haunting. Blatty later said, "He wasn't the man I remembered, but maybe that's what the role needed." When the actor becomes a ghost, does the performance become more honest or more cruel? Fact Hason 3. The premiere took place in a theater that had history and memory. The Exorcist III premiered at the National Theater in Washington, D.C., a calculated choice. This was the same venue where the original Exorcist premiered nearly 2 decades earlier. The same carpet, the same walls, the same shadows. Within 24 hours of the premiere, 2 audience members fainted both during the exorcism scene the studio had insisted on. A power outage hit the block the following night. One usher reportedly quit mid-show, claiming he felt watched in the upper balcony. But here's what makes it stranger. Similar incidents were recorded at the same theater in 1973. Fainting, nausea, projection failures. Coincidence or recurrence? Blatty didn't respond to media inquiries. He just said, "It's where the story began and where it ends." Can a theater remember fear? And can fear, once planted, grow back stronger? Fact Hassan 4. The greatest jump scare almost had a sequel. You know the one. The nurse walks. The hallway stretches. A figure erupts behind her, silent buildup, then surgical shock. But there was more. Blatty originally shot a second scare a beat later from the other side of the frame. A mirror image. No music this time, just a pale figure stepping into frame and freezing. Test audiences didn't scream. They froze, paralyzed. Executives decided it was too much. The footage was shelved. Only a production sketch and one assistant's memory remain. Maybe the scariest thing isn't what jumps at you, it's what you almost saw. Fact Hason 5. The director's cut wasn't in a vault, it was in a closet. For years, fans begged for Blatty's original vision, the version without studio edits, fake exorcisms, or split performances. But it was assumed lost. The reels had vanished. No one knew where the master was. Then, in 2015, someone cleaning out a New York apartment closet found an unmarked VHS tape. It had one word handwritten on the spine: Legion. It was a rough cut, grainy, incomplete but real. It contained extended monologues, missing transitions, and Dourif's full performance. Blatty saw it and wept. That single tape became the backbone of the 2016 director's cut, restoring not just scenes, but soul. Sometimes, the truth doesn't rise from the ashes. It collects dust until someone presses play. Fact Hashani6. The Gemini killer's voice was engineered like a possession. Brad Dourif's performance alone was enough to make skin crawl. But Blatty wanted more. He didn't just want the Gemini killer to sound terrifying, he wanted him to sound impossible. So the audio team created a layered voice effect. First, Dourif's monologue was slowed slightly, making his cadence unnatural. Then, soft whispers were overlaid underneath, some in English, some reversed Latin. And finally, fragments of Jason Miller's voice were subtly mixed in, warping the identity mid-sentence. Sometimes, in the middle of a line, the voice changes not fully, not obviously, but enough to make your subconscious flinch. This wasn't a special effect. It was psychological warfare. When a voice doesn't belong to one person, How do you decide who's really speaking? Fact Hasson 7. The heaven dream scene was a puzzle, not a relief. It opens like peace, white light, a train station, soft music. But something feels wrong. In this dream sequence, we see angels, familiar faces, people playing cards with severed heads, a man with no mouth. Time stops, but no one rests. Blatty didn't write it to calm the viewer. He wrote it to disturb. It's a space where memory, guilt, and judgment overlap, not heaven, but limbo. The cast includes strange cameos. Patrick Ewing as an angel, Fabio standing silently, even a silhouette eerily resembling Father Marin. Each element reflects something broken in Kinderman's mind, a fragmented afterlife shaped by trauma, not salvation. What if heaven isn't what awaits you, but what your conscience builds to trap you? Fact Hasson 8. The real exorcism that followed Blatty for decades. Before The Exorcist was fiction, it was documentation. Blatty based it on a real 1,949 exorcism involving a boy known as Robbie Mannheim. That much is well known, but what he never fully shared was what happened after. For decades, Blatty claimed he received anonymous messages, letters, phone calls, and once, even a voicemail hinting that Robbie had relapsed, or that the demon had never truly left. The details were specific. Names, dates, Latin phrases that were never published, enough to unsettle even a skeptic. He kept everything in a single file box, marked with a handwritten label, 4K. No one knows what's inside. No one's ever opened it. But Blatty once said, "That box is the reason I wrote a third film." Maybe Exorcist III wasn't just a sequel. Maybe it was a final warning. Fact Hassoninen. A scene so disturbing, the film refused to keep it. There's a scene no one has ever seen, not because it was deleted, but because the film wouldn't let it exist. Blatty wrote a sequence in which a priest walks into a church, only to discover his own body, crucified in the pews. Same clothes, same face, a spiritual doubling. They tried filming it 3 times. First, the lens cracked mid-shot. Second, the footage came back completely blank. Third, the lighting board overloaded, and production shut down for hours. After that, Blatty said nothing. He simply cut the scene from the script. No official photos remain. Only a line item in the shooting schedule, and a few crew members who still swear the set felt wrong that day. Can a film reject a scene not because of budget or story, but because something else won't let it be told? Fact #20. The ending they changed and the one they buried in Latin. Blatty's original ending wasn't loud. No fire, no priest screaming into the void, just a whisper. The final line was meant to be, "Let the darkness serve the light," a phrase about balance, about reclaiming evil, not destroying it. It was personal. Blatty had written it years before. But the studio rejected it, calling it too ambiguous. They replaced it with, "I believe, help my unbelief." Biblical, familiar, marketable. Blatty didn't fight. He simply carved the original line, in Latin, into the confessional archway set where no one would see it, but where it would exist. One ending was for the audience, the other was for the man who couldn't say what he really wanted to, but needed to leave it behind anyway. Bonus fact, The Exorcist III wasn't a cult classic until the cult found it. When The Exorcist III was released in 1990, it barely made a sound. Critics were dismissive, audiences were confused. Horror fans, still clinging to spinning heads and pea soup, didn't know what to make of a film that whispered instead of screamed. And so it disappeared, not in shame, but in silence. For over a decade, it lived in the margins. No DVD release, no fanfare, just dusty VHS tapes passed between collectors, late-night television broadcasts, and the occasional murmur in horror forums. It didn't go viral. It didn't trend. It waited, and slowly, it began to resurface. Filmmakers like Jordan Peele, Ari Aster, and Mike Flanagan have since cited The Exorcist III as a masterclass in atmosphere and dread. The director's cut gave it a second life, and a new generation discovered that horror doesn't always need volume, it just needs truth. It was never designed to be a cult classic, but maybe that's exactly why it became one. Some films scream for attention, others just wait to be whispered back into existence. So now you've seen the fractures, the buried truths, and the voices that were nearly silent. But which fact stayed with you? Was it the haunted scene that refused to be filmed? The ending carved into Latin and left behind? Or the voice that didn't belong to any one man? Tell us in the comments, because The Exorcist III doesn't just leave you with fear, it leaves you with questions. And maybe that's the point. What other forgotten film hides stories like this one? What movie do you believe deserves its own resurrection? Like, share, and subscribe if you believe some films age not by fading, but by deepening their shadows.